Hello everyone. This is the final part of the three-part video on setting out and making a joiner's or carpenter's saw, horse or saw stool. So in this last part of this lesson, we shall start by exploring the steps involved in making the sawhorse top and legs off your setting out sheet. Then we will look at the approach to assembling. After that, we will illustrate the steps necessary to mark the end and side rails to form the tray. It will be assumed that you have the basic skills with regard to marking, cutting and chiseling out joints in a safe manner, of course. So here is a view of the top of the sawhorse. Uh, the positions of the mortises on the sawhorse top were marked directly off the plan view on your setting out sheet. And note that the mortises are closer to the end on the underside of this top here. The slope lines for the mortises marked on the edge are taken directly off your elevation view on your setting out sheet that you would have done previous to this. Make sure you keep checking these slope lines so as not to mortise in the wrong direction. Here we have the leg with the dihedral angle already planed on. And I can't emphasize this enough. When marking the legs, it is vital that the first step is to mark the outer corner of the leg that contains the dihedral angle. So I would recommend that you put a line on this outer corner using a crayon or chalk shown here in red. The angle formed by each surface either side of the red line should be more than 90 degrees. Note the sectional view detail that I've drawn here on the left. Next we will mark the compound cut that meets the floor plane. This angle can be got from the true shape developed previously on your setting out sheet. Note that the outer corner line and the floor line form what I call a red uh, crow's foot arrowhead. Do this on all legs, but remember they are handed. They're left hand and right hand in other words. So I would suggest that you label each leg to correlate with each leg that you have on the plan view on your setting out sheet. Then chop that compound cut before marking the tenon at the other ends. And if you've made a mistake in one leg, hopefully you'll have enough waste left on the other end to rectify the cut. Okay. And remember, you have developed the true length distance from the floor plane to the tenon on your setting out sheet. So when you have your tenons marked off your development that you did on your setting out sheet, you will have to plane down the inner face of what I would call this cranked bare face tenon. Um, and this is a very good planing exercise, as your plane strokes will have to be very straight because there's only a short distance to plane. So after having planed one face of your tenon, position the leg onto your bench vise and mark the tenon thickness as shown here with your marking gauge. Now, once it ranges anywhere between 3/4 of an inch to an inch thickness of a tenon, it should suffice for this exercise. So now that the tenon thickness is marked, position the leg into the bench vise as illustrated here and cut the other side of the tenon. So here's an animated view of the tenon after it's cut with the fox wedges coming into place. And notice, of course, there's a saw kerf already cut in approximately 10 mm from either end of the tenon. Um, I would suggest you pick out fox wedges that have a good contrast color against the actual leg, as it is a nice feature on the saw stool. I would also like to add that Make sure you enter both wedges before you start driving them in with your hammer, because if you drive in one wedge too much, it'll close the gap for the other wedge fairly quickly. Um, okay, so bear that in mind when at the assembly process. Now, before we begin assembly, we shall prepare a base template from plywood or some similar material to keep the legs symmetrical at ground level during assembly. If you recall, it will measure 800 by 500 millimeter, which is the plan view rectangle that the sawhorse fits into and you're setting out. Then mark the four rectangular shapes shown in blue, which represents the leg contact at ground level, and then drill a 4 millimeter hole for screw through, favouring the inside corner because the leg is going at a slope, so you don't want the screw protruding out. So here we have the first pair of legs, the left hand leg and the right hand leg, um, screwed up underneath the plywood template. And arriving here now is the top with the two other legs already inserted after glue has been applied to the tenons. So now drive your screws up into those other two legs through the plywood base also. So to keep the shape symmetrical on the side, keep a check on those diagonals shown in blue and make sure they're equal. Also, as you are clamping, keep checking that the diagonal measurements shown here in blue are also equal. You can also use a template marked from the through shape you developed previously on your setting out sheet instead of checking the diagonals if you so wish. One approach to clamping this saw tool is to make a yoke clamp. It's basically made up of two threaded bars that goes through two pieces of timber. But first we must determine the positions of the holes on the plywood base for the threaded bar to go through, as you can see animated here. So here is an animation of the yoke clamps mentioned earlier. Loosening or tightening the nuts will lengthen or shorten the diagonals across the legs where necessary. As you are tightening the nuts on this clamp, pay close attention to the shoulder joint between the leg and the underside of the sawhorse top. You may find that you will have to loosen one end a little whilst tightening the opposite end in order to close any gap that's evident at these joints during the assembly process. You will also need to sight across the face of the legs as you are tightening the clamps to ensure you're not creating a twist in the sawhorse as animated here. Now another way of clamping is to clamp the saw stool off the bottom of your workbench as shown here. Now if your workbench happens to be a bit narrower, you might have to screw on a piece of 4x2 or something similar onto the bottom apron of the bench that I've illustrated there. So it all depends, of course. And I just want to make the point that you may have to shift the clamps to the left or right, as illustrated here, to keep the diagonals equal and avoid twist as you're clamping. And note that sometimes it may be necessary to put a shim underneath this clamped piece of wood here to counteract the bending forces of those clamps that can cause joints to open on the inner leg side due to that bending. And here's another alternative, which is to put supports under the ply base itself at each end. They're strong enough so they will not bend easily when the pressure is applied from the clamps. So here's a picture of the sawhorse after assembly, ready for the end rails to be fitted. This sawhorse is made from red deal and it has a teak fox wedges inserted. And also note that the legs have a taper planed on prior to assembly. In this example, now you can also put on that taper after assembly if you so wish. So here's our end rail shown in blue. Um, Rather than a rectangular section, it's actually a parallelogram, as you can see there by the sectional detail. So just making the point here that you need to plane the top and bottom surface of the end rail parallel to the sawhorse top. And as stated there, note the section detail below. And the size is 45 by 30 millimeter. So clamp the end rail 220 millimeter from the underside of the top to the bottom of the end rail, and just leave the ends about 1 millimeter proud of the leg when you mark that angle on the outside of the leg. So after having clamped the end rail in that position, mark the shoulder line for the dovetail from the inside surface of the legs as animated here. And note that the dovetail thickness will be 12 millimeter for this particular exercise. As you'll see animated here, the dovetail slope will be square onto the shoulder line from the outer corner. And remember that the edge of the tail is parallel to the top of the saw stool. Do not chisel it square from the face of the dovetail. So when the dovetail joint has been cut on the end rail, reposition it back on the end of the saw stool and mark its housing as animated here. And note that I've set the bevel to the angle where it joins the underside of the saw stool top, and this is the same angle you'll be using for the housing now for this dovetail, as you can see here. So before we put on side rails for the tray, we must first plane the inside edge of the end rail vertical, so we'll have a vertical wall on the inside where our tray is. So you can see the two sectional details there on the left hand side. One is before and one is after the inner wall has been made vertical. Now we are ready to fix and glue side rails and one end rail into place. Second end rail glued when plywood bottom is slid into place into its groove. So here's an animation of the plywood bottom sliding into the groove. It's up to yourself what size plywood bottom you're going to put into it. Something like 1/4 inch, I guess, is plenty good enough really. So at this stage we can remove the base from the saw tool, as the end and side rails are now preventing the legs from moving or spreading. So if it hasn't been done previously, the legs can now be tapered and the bottom edges of the legs slightly rounded with a sandpaper and block to prevent splintering when the saw horse is dragged along the floor, as you would with any piece of furniture. So hopefully if you have completed the project to match the setting out, with most joints closed, with gaps no more than 3/4 of a millimeter, then congratulations, you have not only produced a sawhorse, but what is a jointed piece of furniture to a high standard. You have engaged with a furniture building exercise from setting out to the completed project. So well done, everyone. Okay, all right, all the best.